The in-laws laughed when they left a $50 cabin in the inheritance, not knowing what it was hiding. Sarah was sitting among the other heirs when the lawyer opened the envelope and read her name out loud. For a moment, a thread of hope crossed her chest. But what came next drew poorly disguised laughter from the whole room. A stone cabin out in the countryside, recorded in the documents as worth $50. Nothing more. While her in-laws received properties, bank accounts, and shares in the family business, she inherited 4 walls in ruins, on a barren stretch of land no one had visited in decades. The mother-in-law covered her mouth with her hand, but the laughter still slipped out. And the oldest brother-in-law, Robert, didn't even bother to hide it. "At least it matches what she brought to this family," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sarah didn't answer. She kept her spine straight and her eyes dry, her hands resting on the blue dress she had chosen so carefully that morning. It was the dress she wore on days when she needed courage. She never imagined she'd need it so much on a day like that. The lawyer's office was downtown, in an old townhouse with tall windows that let in sunlight too strong for that time of the afternoon. Sarah had been there since early, beside her husband Daniel, who had been quiet since they walked in. He had a way of shrinking in difficult situations, of becoming invisible to survive the weight of his own family, and she knew that shrinking by heart. She had already learned not to expect him to speak first. Around them, the other children of Mr. Samuel occupied the chairs like people sitting on thrones. Robert, the eldest, in a dark suit and an expression that suggested he already knew what was written before the envelope was even opened. Jennifer, the middle daughter, who had travelled from far away and barely said hello to Sarah when she arrived. And Megan, the youngest, who stayed in a corner with her eyes down, as if she preferred not to be there. The mother-in-law, Mrs. Martha, sat right at the front, purse on her lap and posture rigid, the same posture she used when she wanted to show she was in control of everything. The lawyer read each item carefully. The main estate went to Robert. The city apartment went to Jennifer. A small monthly allowance was allocated to Megan, and then came Sarah's name. To the daughter-in-law, Sarah Collins Miller, wife of the son Daniel, the rural property identified in the registry as White Creek Plot is allocated, located in the municipality of Timber Ridge, with a declared value of $50. The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then came the laughter. Sarah felt the heat rise to her face, but she didn't let any tears come near her eyes. It was a skill she had developed over the years she had spent in that family, the art of not giving them what they wanted to see. Daniel put his hand on her knee for a second, but it was a weak gesture, like an apology without the courage to say the words. $50, Robert repeated, settling back in his chair with a smile. I guess the old man was still generous. None of those present disputed it, not even the lawyer, who continued reading the rest of the document as if nothing had happened. Only Megan looked away toward the window. Sarah left the office with her head held high and the document folded inside her purse. On the street, the sun beat down hard on the sidewalk, and the smell of hot asphalt mixed with the noise of cars. Daniel walked beside her for a while without speaking. She didn't speak either. Sometimes, silence was the only honest language that existed between the two of them. When they got home, she put the document on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The kettle heated up and whistled. She didn't even notice. There was something there that didn't add up. It wasn't the injustice. Though the injustice was real and painful, it was something else. A question gnawed at her from the inside. Why had Mr. Samuel included her in the will with a specific asset, even if symbolic, when he could have simply left her name out? The old man wasn't one for meaningless gestures. She knew that better than anyone in that family. She had spent years taking care of him, while the legitimate children rarely showed up. Those were years of waking up early to prepare the right medicine at the right time, afternoons lost in clinic waiting rooms, nights when he woke up disoriented and she was the first to appear in the hallway. Mr. Samuel had been a closed-off man of few words, who kept things inside himself with the same tenacity with which he kept the land he owned. But there were moments, rare and precious, when he let his guard down. Usually in the early hours, when pain woke him up and he sat on the porch drinking a glass of water. It was on one of those early mornings that he said to Sarah, looking out into the dark, You're the only one who sees me as a person, Sarah. The others only see me as property. She hadn't said anything that night. She just stayed by his side until he wanted to go back to bed. Now, alone in the kitchen, she remembered that phrase and felt there was more to the will than $50 and a ruined stone cabin. In the following days, while cleaning out Mr. Samuel's room, Sarah found a small wooden box tucked at the back of the wardrobe, behind stacks of old sheets that smelled of mothballs. Inside there was a worn rosary, 2 faded photographs, and a folded map with yellowed edges from age. She picked up the map carefully, like someone picking up something that might fall apart in their hands. The paper was brittle at the folds, but intact. It was a hand-drawn sketch, traced with pencil and ink, showing a plot of land with irregular boundaries, noted landmarks, and olive trees drawn in groups scattered across the area. In the lower right corner, there was a date written in small handwriting 42 years ago. Sarah stared at that map for a time she couldn't measure. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her bag, along with the will document. She didn't say anything to Daniel that night. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Those were restless days. Sarah went to work in the morning, came back in the afternoon, made dinner, talked to Daniel about unimportant things. But inside, that folded map inside her bag seemed to pulse like a living thing. She took it out several times to examine it, compared it with the will document, tried to figure out exactly where that plot called White Creek Plot was. On one of those nights, while Daniel slept, she sat at the kitchen table with the map open in front of her and the faded photographs beside it. There was something in those images she couldn't let go of. The image of a young Mr. Samuel smiling among the trees with a smile she had never seen on the old sick man she had cared for. It was like meeting a version of him that had existed before life and family, and years had hidden him away. She thought about how many versions of a person are buried inside them without the people around ever knowing. How many stored-up joys, how many silent passions, how many secret places where someone feels whole, while the rest of the world only knows them by the outer shell. Mr. Samuel had kept that land like a secret of himself, and he had chosen to pass it on to the person he had realized knew how to listen in silence. The responsibility of that weighed on her in a way that wasn't bad. It was the weight of something worth carrying. Timber Ridge was a small town, about 60 miles from there, known for its rural farmers and a landscape of dry earth and open sky. Sarah had never been there, but she knew Mr. Samuel had bought that area decades ago, before the children were born, back when that region was even more isolated than it is today. One Friday morning, without telling anyone, she took the car early. She put the map on the passenger seat, the will document inside her purse, and hit the road before the sun got too hot. The road leading to Timber Ridge kept narrowing as she went. Gas stations grew farther apart, houses became more distant from one another, and the landscape shifted from asphalt and sidewalks to red dirt and the gnarled trees of the region. Sarah drove calmly, following the map's directions as best she could, stopping a few times to ask residents she met along the roadside. It was an old man in a straw hat who pointed her the right way. He looked at the name on the document, tapped his thumb on the paper and said, "Ah, the White Creek Plot. Take that dirt road there, go through the old eucalyptus gate and follow until you see where the olive trees start. You'll know when you get there." She thanked him and went on. The packed dirt road was narrow, full of loose stones that shook the car. On both sides, the low, dry brush opened up here and there to reveal patches of pale rock, warmed by the sun. And then, after a gentle curve in the road, the olive trees appeared. Sarah stopped the car and stared out the window for a long moment. They were ancient trees, very ancient. The trunks were twisted, thick, covered in grey, rough bark, with branches that spread in every direction like arms embracing the wind. The small silver leaves trembled slightly, catching the morning sun in thousands of glimmers. And they stretched as far as the eye could see, forming a landscape that looked pulled from another time. In the middle of them, almost hidden by the vegetation that had grown around over the years, stood the cabin. The stone walls were still standing, with small shrubs sprouting from the joints. The chimney rose intact in the center, and the wooden door had rotted away, leaving the entrance open like a mouth. The roof had given way in one corner, but the rest still held. Sarah got out of the car with the map in her hands and stood there before it all. The wind brought the smell of dry earth and sun-warmed olive leaves. An old, clean scent she had never smelled before, but that for some reason felt familiar. She walked slowly to the cabin, looking at every detail. She entered through the doorless doorway and stayed inside for a while. The floor was uneven stone. The walls were thick, more than half a meter, keeping the interior cool even with the heat outside. There was a wooden shelf still nailed to the wall, with a few broken clay pots lined up on it, and in the corner, leaning against the stone, a long bench covered in moss. Someone had spent a lot of time in that place. She came out and looked back at the olive trees. Some had trunks so thick that two adults could barely hold hands around them. They were trees that took decades to reach that size, maybe more. Sarah folded the map and put it in her pocket. She stayed there a while longer, standing among those ancient trees, feeling a weight she couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, nor joy. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of being in the right place for the first time in a long time. On the way home, she almost called Daniel to tell him. But something stopped her. She needed to understand what she had found before she opened her mouth. Back in the city, she started asking around. She asked a neighbor who worked in the rural area if she knew someone who understood olive trees. The neighbor recommended an agronomist named Mr. George, who had worked for many years with local growers and knew the land of Timber Ridge well. Sarah called him that very night. Mr. George was a middle-aged man, short and dark-skinned, with calloused hands and a slow way of speaking, as if he chose his words carefully before letting them out. When Sarah met him the following week, she brought the map, the document, and some photos she had taken with her cell phone during the visit. He looked at everything carefully, then asked to visit the land in person. They went together on a Tuesday morning. Mr. George spent hours walking the property on foot, examining the trunks of the olive trees, observing the color of the soil, testing the ground with a small tool he took from his backpack. Sarah followed him in silence, without hurry. When he finally stopped, it was under one of the larger trees. He stood quietly for a while, looking at the twisted trunk with an expression that Sarah couldn't decipher. "How old do you think this tree is?" she asked. He ran his hand over the rough bark before answering. "This one, 200 years, maybe more." He took a step back and looked at the canopy. "Look at the size. Look how the trunk splits up there. These marks here are from prunings done decades ago. Someone took care of this tree for a long time. My father-in-law used to come here. Often? I'm not sure. But I think so." Mr. George nodded slowly. "Makes sense. These trees are doing well. Not as well as they could with more intensive care, but well enough to show they weren't completely abandoned. They walked a bit more." He stopped in an area where the soil was darker and moister, even without recent rain, and bent down to pick up a handful of dirt that he rubbed between his fingers. "This soil here is excellent," he said almost to himself. "It has good depth, good drainage, and the slope of the land helps with aeration. It's the kind of soil agronomists search for years and never find." Sarah stood still, listening. "And do olive trees in this kind of soil produce very well?" she asked. "They do, but that's not all." He stood up and wiped his hand on his pants. "When you have an old olive tree, 200 years old, in soil like this, you're not just producing oil. You're producing something with history inside. The flavor is different. The acidity is different. The specialty market pays much more for it." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "How much more?" she asked, her voice controlled. Mr. George looked at her with a care that seemed respectful to her. "It depends on a lot of things still, but this land, with these trees and this soil, is not worth $50. It's not worth 50,000. It could be worth much more if it's well worked." Sarah said nothing. She stood looking at the olive trees for a long time, with the folded map in her hand and her heart beating in a rhythm she didn't recognize. When she got home that afternoon, she found Daniel on the couch watching the news. She sat down next to him, waited for the segment to end, and then told him everything. The map, the visit, the agronomist, what he had said about the soil and the trees. Daniel listened in silence. His face changed gradually as she spoke. First, there was curiosity, then something like discomfort. And finally, when she finished, there was that closure she knew so well, that kind of door he closed from the inside when the matter got too big. "Sarah," he said at last, "I don't want trouble with my family." That response hurt more than her mother-in-law's laughter, more than Robert's comment, because it came from someone who was supposed to be on the inside. She nodded silently, got up, and went to the bedroom. She closed the door without slamming it. From the other side of the wall she heard the sound of the news continuing, then the creak of the sofa as Daniel stood up, then silence. And then, after a long while, the sound of his footsteps heading to the kitchen, the noise of water being poured into a glass, and silence again. She knew he stayed up late that night. She knew from the different silence that existed when the house was empty of thoughts, and from the silence that exists when someone is awake pretending to be asleep. Lying in bed in the dark, she thought about everything she had given to that family. The years caring for Mr. Samuel, the holiday parties where she arrived early to help organize and was the last to be greeted. The Sunday lunches where the legitimate children debated their father's business while she served the table. The way Mrs. Martha had learned not to call her by her name, always using the daughter-in-law or Daniel's wife, as if naming her would give her an existence she didn't deserve. Sarah hadn't cried any of those times, but that night in the darkness of the room, she let the tears flow silently, not out of weakness, but because there are limits to what a person can swallow without some relief. She slept late and woke early, and when she got up she had a clarity she hadn't had the night before. She wasn't going to sign anything. She wasn't going to give anything up, and she wasn't going to wait for anyone to help her find out what that plot of land held. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was Robert. "Sarah." His voice was casual but carried a tension underneath. "I took a look at the will documents. That property has some title issues that could give you a lot of headaches. The family is willing to make things easier for you. We'll buy your share for $1,000 and handle the whole process." $1,000, she repeated. "It's a fair price given the condition of the property." Sarah was silent for 2 seconds. "I'll think about it," she said. "Don't take too long. These things have deadlines." She hung up the phone, set it on the table, and stared at it as if that call were a piece of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Robert knew the value. That was the only possible conclusion. He had said title issues with the ease of someone who had researched before calling. The offer of $1,000 for a property that an agronomist had evaluated as potentially very valuable wasn't carelessness. It was a move. 2 days later, Mrs. Martha showed up at her door without warning. She had always had that habit of showing up unannounced as a reminder that the house where Sarah lived was, in some way, still family territory. Sarah received her with coffee, listened attentively while her mother-in-law spoke with a softness she had learned to distrust. "Sarah, I know things got a little tense at the will reading, but the thing is, the stone cabin has a very messy document history. Samuel never sorted it out properly. For you, who already has so much to worry about, this property would just be one more problem. The family can take care of it." "What exactly are you offering me?" Mrs. Martha smiled with the patience of someone used to handling difficult conversations. "To take the problem off your hands. You give us the property, and we handle the paperwork. No cost to you." Sarah poured more coffee, listened to the rest. Then, when her mother-in-law finished, she replied calmly, "I need some time to think, Mrs. Martha." The mother-in-law left without the smile she had entered with. Sarah was alone in the kitchen, with the 2 cups on the table. And only then did she let the air slowly out of her lungs, like someone who had just made it through something without falling. That same night, she took the old map from the drawer where she had stored it and began to examine it more carefully than before. She had spent days thinking about that map, but always focusing on the olive trees, the land, the value. This time, she paid attention to the smaller details, the pencil notes in the margins, small measurements, references to stones, indications of distances between specific trees. and at two different points on the map, underlined with such pressure that it had left grooves in the paper, the words, "larger area than what is recorded." Sarah read that 3 times. Then she looked at the will document, which stated the lot's dimensions. She went back to the map. The hand-drawn lines that marked the property boundaries extended far beyond what the recorded dimensions suggested. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she looked up an acquaintance named Brenda who had gone through a land dispute a few years earlier and had managed to resolve the case with the help of a specialist in rural property regularization. Brenda gave her the name of a professional named Michael, who worked in a neighboring town and had done the job with seriousness and competence. Sarah called him that same day. Michael was tall, thin, wore glasses, with that way of someone who deals so much with paperwork, that he began to see the world in maps and measurements. When she described the situation over the phone, he asked a few pointed questions, asked her to send photos of the old map and the registration document, and said he would study them before scheduling a visit. He called back in 2 days. "From what I've seen, this is very interesting," he said without preamble. "The recorded dimensions and the references described on the map don't match. I need to go to the property to confirm, but based on what you sent me, there's a considerable difference between what's on paper and what actually exists." "What kind of difference?" "It's possible that the actual area is significantly larger than what the registration indicates. This happened a lot in the old days, when surveys were done by hand and not always accurately, sometimes out of carelessness, sometimes intentionally, to register less than what existed." "Why would someone do that intentionally?" "Taxes, disputes with neighbors, sometimes for family strategy." He paused. "But that's speculation. What we need is to go there and measure." They scheduled the visit for the following weekend. In that interval, Robert called again, this time without the previous casualness. "Sarah, did you hire someone to mess with that land?" She was quiet for a moment. Someone had talked, or he had found out some other way. "I'm taking care of the property that was left to me," she said. "That's a mistake," he said, and his voice had changed tone. "You're opening a process that will cost more than the land is worth, and it's going to create a problem for the family that doesn't need to exist." "If the land isn't worth anything, Robert, why are you so worried?" Silence on the other end. "You're getting into something you don't understand," he said finally. "Maybe so," she replied, "but I'm learning." She hung up, and this time she didn't put the phone on the table. She kept it in her hand, her heart racing, and pressed record before realizing what she was doing. Then she looked at the phone and thought for a while. There was nothing wrong with saving a conversation that had taken place, just precaution. When Daniel came home that afternoon, she told him she had hired Michael to evaluate the property. And then, because she had reached a point where she could no longer keep everything to herself, she also told him about Robert's call. Daniel listened with a closed face. "Did you record the conversation with my brother?" "It wasn't planned. But yes." He stood in the middle of the living room for a while without moving. There was a tension in him that she knew, that tension of someone caught between two sides and not knowing how to exist in both at the same time. "Sarah, this is going to start a war. Daniel, the war has already started. I just didn't know I was in it." He didn't answer. But that night, she didn't go to sleep right away. She stayed on the porch for hours, she knew, because she heard the chair creaking outside while she tried to sleep. Michael went to the plot the following Saturday. He brought surveying equipment, an assistant, and spent the whole day walking the boundaries of the property. Sarah spent the entire afternoon with them, walking the land, watching as he jotted down measurements in a notebook with meticulous precision. At the end of the day, he sat in the shade of one of the larger olive trees and opened the notebook. "Sarah, the registered plot is a little over 2 hectares. He turned the notebook toward her so she could see the numbers. "The actual plot, according to the physical markers that are here on the ground and correspond exactly to the old map, is nearly 6 hectares. She stared at the numbers for a while. "3 times bigger," she said, "practically." He took off his glasses and wiped them on his shirt. "What's registered is a fraction of what's here. The rest has no defined title in the current registry, but there are physical markers. There are documentary references on the map, and there are clear signs of continuous historical use of the land. This can be regularized. It's not simple, but it's possible. How long does it take? Months. Could be longer. Depends on how it goes. But what you have in hand here is enough to start the process. Sarah looked at the olive trees around her. The sun was low and made the leaves shine with a golden hue. A gentle breeze passed through the branches, and the sound was like a very ancient whisper. She thought of Mr. Samuel, sitting here on this same plot, with this same map, writing those words with heavy pressure, area larger than what appears in the registry. He knew, he had known for decades, and he had chosen to leave it to her. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot. We're just starting out. Now continuing. The following week, while Michael started the bureaucratic part of the regularization process, Sarah went back to the plot on her own. There was no specific reason to go that day. It was an ordinary Tuesday. But she felt a need she couldn't ignore, a kind of silent call from that place that had gotten into her head and didn't want to leave. When she arrived, she found an elderly man sitting on a stone bench near the cabin. He was a gentleman with completely white hair, a lean body and a stooped posture, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. He wore worn-out fabric pants and a flannel shirt, despite the heat. Sarah slowed her pace. He looked up when he heard the car. "Are you the new owner?" he asked without getting up, his voice deep with the weight of years. "I am." She approached. "But how did you get in here?" "Oh." He made a vague gesture with his hand. "I've been coming in here for over 40 years, young lady. I know every stone on this plot." He paused. "I've worked here since Samuel bought the land. I take care of the olive trees." Sarah stopped completely. "You worked for my father-in-law?" "I did. Still do, if you want to put it that way." He looked at the trees around him. "Nobody told me to leave, and as long as nobody does, I'll keep coming." She stared at that old man for a moment. There was something about him that seemed part of that place, like the stones and the olive trees. "What's your name?" she asked. "Anthony. But everyone calls me Tony." She sat down next to him on the stone bench, and that was how, on that bench, on a hot, sunny afternoon, she first heard the story of that plot told by someone who had been there. Tony had come to those lands when he was young, brought by a relative who knew the area. Mr. Samuel had bought the plot years before, when the land was still cheap and no one paid attention to that part of the region. He had planted the first olive saplings with his own hands, back when no one in the region planted olive trees, and everyone thought it wouldn't come to anything. "But Samuel knew what he was doing," said Tony, with a certainty that needed no further explanation. "He didn't talk much, but he thought a lot. He read a lot about olive trees, about soil, about oil. He studied on his own, and he came here for years to take care of these trees, do the right pruning, prepare the land." "Did the family know?" The old man shook his head slowly. "They never knew." A pause. He didn't want them to know. He used to say the family saw value in everything except the right things, that if they knew about the land, they'd want to sell it before understanding what they had. Sarah was silent for a moment. "Why did he leave me this land?" she asked. She didn't expect Tony to know, but she had to ask. The old man turned his face toward her. He had dark, deep eyes with that clarity that sometimes only comes with age. "Because you were the only one who truly asked how he was," he said. "Every time you went to take care of him, Samuel would tell me about it afterward. He said you asked with your eyes, not your mouth, that you were different from the other people around him." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest that she couldn't control. "Did he plan this?" she said, her voice a little quieter. "I don't know if he planned it, but he chose it." Tony stood up slowly with the visible effort of someone carrying many years in their joints. "And now you came. So, I guess he chose right." They walked together through the olive trees that afternoon. Tony showed her every part of the land, identifying the trees by traits that only someone who had spent decades living with them could recognize. He explained the production cycle, pointed out where the olives were ripest, indicated the spots where the soil needed attention. When the sun was beginning to lower, and the olive trees cast long shadows on the rocky ground, Sarah took from her bag the 2 photographs she had found in the small wooden box. She held them out to Tony without saying anything. He took the photos carefully, like someone who knows old paper is fragile. He looked at the first one of young Samuel smiling among the trees. He was quiet for a while. "This one was taken the first summer he really spent here," said Tony, his voice lower than usual. "He was planting the new saplings. He stayed 3 weeks straight. He said he needed to understand the land before working on it." He moved to the second photo, the older man with the olive branch raised. "That's my father," he said. Sarah stared at him. "Your father?" He was the one who brought Samuel here for the first time. They were old friends, from when both were young in a small town in the countryside that doesn't really exist anymore. "My father knew this land since he was a boy, because his grandfather worked around here. When Samuel said he wanted to buy a piece of land where he could plant olive trees, my father brought him here." The story was deepening in a way Sarah hadn't expected. It was like peeling something that reveals new layers every time. "And you kept taking care of the land after your father couldn't anymore?" "I did." Tony handed the photos back with the same care he had taken them. "My father worked here until he was in his 70s. After that he couldn't walk properly anymore. But he'd come sit on this bench every now and then, just to look at the trees." He paused. He died peacefully, he did, with the feeling that he had taken care of something that would outlast him. There was a continuity in that which moved Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. 3 generations of workers who had cared for that land. 3 generations of Samuel's people who had dreamed of it. And now she, who had arrived by chance and discovered out of curiosity, was standing among those ancient trees as just another link in a chain that was longer than she had imagined. When the sun truly began to dip and the breeze grew cooler through the branches, Sarah looked at that old man with white hair and calloused hands and asked, "Tony, would you be willing to keep caring for these olive trees? This time with a contract with regular payment, with everything as it should be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded his head with a silent dignity that was more than any words. "I'm willing, I am. But now you're the one in charge here." Sarah reached out her hand. He took it with his 2 large, calloused hands. And that was how a deal was sealed that Mr. Samuel had probably already envisioned. In the following days, Sarah began to organize what needed to be done. She made a list of everything. The legalization process with Michael, the olive tree management with Tony, the evaluation of productive potential with Mr. George. Each part needed to move forward at the same time, and there was much she still didn't know. But learning had become the main activity of her days. She researched homemade olive oil production at night, after dinner. She read about harvest cycles, extraction techniques, what set apart a common olive oil from a high-quality one. The more she read, the more she understood why those ancient olive trees, on that soil, on that land, represented something out of the ordinary. Daniel watched all of this from a distance. He hadn't said anything more about the family or the land situation. There was a distance between them that was new and painful, and Sarah felt it like a small fracture that widens over time if left untreated. One morning, Sarah found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table before she woke up. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and was staring into space. She noticed he hadn't slept much. "Are you okay?" she asked. He took a second to answer. "I'm thinking," he said. She poured herself some coffee and sat on the other side of the table. She waited. "When my father got really sick," he said, his voice slow, "I was afraid, not of losing him, but of having to face what I hadn't resolved with him. So I started pulling away, working more, traveling more." He looked at his cup. "And the one who stayed was you." Sarah didn't say anything. "I did that and didn't even realize I was doing it," he continued. "I only realize it now, looking back." She was silent for a moment. There were many things she could say. Some were fair, some were harsher than the moment called for. "What do you want to do about it?" she said at last. "I want to stop being on the wrong side without realizing it." It was simple, and not simple. But Sarah felt those words land differently from the other conversations they'd had. There was something real there. Around the same time, Robert had started acting in ways she hadn't expected. Twice he ran into her in town, which in a small town could be coincidence, but the remarks he made on those occasions were too careful to be casual. The first time he made a vague comment about how land regularization processes were long and expensive, and mostly not worth the effort. The second time he mentioned he knew someone interested in buying land in the Timber Ridge area, who paid well, who didn't ask questions. Then he said he was just mentioning it, that it was nothing, and left. Sarah wrote down each of those conversations in a notebook, with the date and what had been said, not out of paranoia. Out of the habit of someone who learned that words thrown out in passing are sometimes the most important ones to keep. It was on a Wednesday night that she found out what had happened behind her back. Megan, the younger sister-in-law, called late, her voice low, like someone speaking close to someone else who shouldn't hear. She said there had been a family meeting 2 days before, which Sarah hadn't been told about, that Robert had proposed contesting the part of the will regarding the stone cabin, claiming that Mr. Samuel wasn't in full mental capacity when the document was drawn up, that the family had agreed, except for Megan, who had tried to argue but couldn't change anything, and that the process would begin the following week. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, her voice calm despite everything. Megan was silent for a moment. "Because I was there when you took care of Dad. I saw it. They didn't see it, because they weren't there. But I went a few times, and I saw." A pause. "And because what they're doing is wrong." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. Then she silently thanked her and hung up. She stood in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then she went to the room where Daniel was sleeping and turned on the bedside lamp. He woke with a start. "Sarah? What's wrong?" She sat on the edge of the bed and told him everything. The meeting she hadn't been called to, the intention to contest the will, and then, without planning, she tapped the audio file on her phone and played the conversation with Robert. Daniel listened without moving. When it ended, he was silent for a long time. The lamp cast shadows on the wall. Outside, an owl called from somewhere far away. "I didn't know about this," he said, his voice different, heavier. "I know you didn't. He talked to you like that." That was the mildest tone. In the first calls, he was more careful. Daniel ran his hand over his face. He stayed like that for a while, covering his eyes. "Sarah," he said finally, "I need to apologize to you for things I let happen." She didn't answer right away. She looked at him in the dark with that weight of years in her chest. "Are you going to do this now?" she said without harshness. "In the middle of all of this?" "Yes, because I shouldn't have waited this long." She was quiet for a while longer. Then she said, "All right, but we need to take care of what's in front of us first." He nodded, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt that maybe she wasn't alone. The process to contest the will was filed by the family the following week, as Megan had predicted. It was a claim that Mr. Samuel had signed the will during a moment of reduced capacity, which in practice meant calling into question the expressed wishes of a man who had planned that act for years. Sarah asked Michael to recommend a professional specialized in inheritance matters. He recommended a lawyer named Ms. Susan, a middle-aged woman with short black hair with a direct and efficient way of speaking that inspired confidence from the first meeting. Miss Susan listened to everything, asked specific questions, and then looked at Sarah with an evaluating expression. "Do you have proof that you took care of your father-in-law?" "I have medical prescriptions I organized, pharmacy receipts with dates, photos, text messages with his doctor." "And are there witnesses?" "Tony, who works on the property and had regular contact with my father-in-law, and Megan, the sister-in-law." "Is Megan willing to testify?" Sarah hesitated. "She's afraid of the family." "I understand, but it could be important." Miss Susan opened a notebook and began to write. "The central point here will be Mr. Samuel's mental state at the time the will was signed. We need the doctor who treated him. The doctor in question was Dr. Richard, who had been Mr. Samuel's physician for over a decade. He was a reserved but rigorous man who kept detailed records of all his patients. Miss Susan contacted him. He didn't take long to respond. In a few days, Dr. Richard confirmed in writing that Mr. Samuel had been lucid and oriented until weeks before his passing, that he had shown clarity about his assets and his intentions, that the claim of diminished capacity had no support in the medical records he had filled out throughout his entire treatment. When this confirmation reached the body reviewing the challenge, the case was dismissed. Sarah found out via a message from Ms. Susan, direct and unadorned. Case dismissed, will valid, property yours. She read the message 3 times. Then she put her phone in her pocket and carried on with what she was doing, which was making dinner. Her hands didn't tremble, her face didn't change, but there was something inside her chest that let go in that moment, like a knot that had been tight for months and finally gave way. Daniel arrived while she was still in the kitchen. He saw her expression and asked without words. "They dismissed it," she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he came over to her and hugged her in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. A real hug, unhurried, without the unspoken apologies that used to inhabit the space between them. "I called Robert today," he said, still holding her. She pulled back slightly to look at him. "What did you say?" "I said I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore when I knew you were being treated unfairly." He paused. He got mad. Really mad. Another pause. But it was necessary. Sarah stared at her husband. There was something different about him that took her a second to identify. It was that he was present, truly present, without the familiar armor that usually kept him at a certain distance from everything. "Was it hard?" she asked. "Very," he said. "But you've been facing hard things for years, and I stood by without acting. It's time to change that." She didn't answer with words. She went back into the hug and stayed there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months settle in a different way in her body. The harvest of the first olives happened the following autumn. Tony coordinated everything, with that knowledge that comes not from books, but from decades of practice. Sarah was present at every stage, learning as she worked, getting her hands dirty with soil and olive pulp, with a satisfaction she had never felt in any office. They hired a small group of local workers, residents of Timber Ridge, who knew the land and needed income. Among them was a woman named Samantha, with the same name as her father-in-law, which made Sarah smile the first time she heard her introduce herself. Samantha was in her mid-50s, with grown children, and worked with the agility of someone who learned early on that life doesn't wait. She was the one who kept the group lively during the most tiring hours of the harvest, telling stories of when the area was busier, of harvest festivals that brought the whole neighborhood together, of a time she described with nostalgia but no sadness. During a break on the second day of harvest, while the group rested in the shade of the olive trees with water bottles and cookies Sarah had brought, Samantha looked at the trees around with a thoughtful expression. "My grandmother knew this land," she said suddenly. Sarah turned to her. "She did? She used to talk about some old olive trees on an abandoned plot near here. She said that when she was a girl she would come pick olives with her mother. Back then there was no fixed owner, it was land everyone used a bit." She paused. After an owner showed up, no one came anymore. But she kept talking about those trees until the end of her life. There was a web of stories there that was more extensive than any document. Sarah looked at the olive trees around her and thought about all the people who had passed through there over the centuries, harvesting, caring, watching, remembering. She was just the latest one. Tony guided them, and Sarah followed every step of the process, from the careful hand harvesting to avoid bruising the fruit to the transport to a partner mill recommended by Mr. George. The oil produced from that first harvest had a golden color with green highlights and an aroma that Mr. George described as something you can't describe until you taste it. When Sarah tasted it for the first time, dipping a piece of bread directly into the freshly extracted oil, she was silent for a moment. It was good. It was really good. It was the kind of thing that made it clear, without needing explanation, that there was something special about that soil and those trees. "Mister," George had spoken with an artisan producer named Mrs. Beverly, who produced and sold oils and preserves from the region in specialty markets and food fairs. She was a woman in her 60s, sturdy, with grey hair and a firm voice, who had built the business with her own hands over decades. Mrs. Beverly came to the land one morning, tasted the oil straight from the container, was quiet for a moment, and then turned to Sarah with bright eyes. "Where did this come from?" "From the olive trees over there." Sarah pointed to the row of older trees. "How old are those trees?" "The oldest ones, over 200 years. Mrs. Beverly stared at the trees for a long moment. Then she turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed surprise and recognition. "I've been in the olive oil business for 30 years, she said, "and I've never tasted anything like this produced here in the region." A pause. "Do you want to partner up?" Mrs. Beverly's proposal was straightforward. She would market the oil under a regional brand she was building, with distinctive packaging and access to markets that paid for quality product. The split would be fair, with Sarah receiving the larger share as the producer. Mrs. Beverly would handle the sales logistics and a margin on sales. Sarah listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then said she needed a day to think. That night, she and Daniel sat on the porch with a glass of water each and talked late into the evening. It was the first long conversation they'd had in months, not about problems, not about family, but about the future, about what could be built with those olive trees, with that land, with that oil. Daniel said he was in, that he wanted to help, that he was capable of learning whatever was needed. Sarah signed the partnership with Mrs. Beverly the following week. The process of regularizing the land, handled by Michael, moved forward more smoothly than she had expected. The physical markers, the old map with Mr. Samuel's notes, the historical records of land use that Tony had confirmed with his own testimony, all of that formed a set of evidence that supported the claim. It took months, as Michael had predicted, but in the end, the land was fully regularized. When the documents arrived, Sarah opened them on the kitchen table with slightly cold hands. She read every line carefully. The land, with its full real extent of nearly 6 hectares, was registered in her name. The century-old olive trees, the fertile soil, the stone cabin, and the chimney that stood against time. All of it was hers. She folded the documents, stored them in the plastic folder she had bought especially for that purpose, and placed it on top of the refrigerator. Then she made some coffee, went out to the porch, and stared at the street for a while alone with her thoughts. There was a satisfaction in that moment that was different from anything she had ever felt. It wasn't the satisfaction of having beaten someone. It was the satisfaction of having found something that had been left for her and not letting it be taken from her hands. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out. Now continuing, the second harvest was bigger than the first. Tony had managed the trees correctly after the first season, and the production responded. The oldest olive trees, those with thick trunks and branches that seemed to want to reach in all directions at once, produced more than Mr. George had predicted for a first season of intensive care. Daniel started going to the plot frequently. He hadn't promised it with big words. He simply started showing up. First on a Saturday to help with the harvest. Then on a Wednesday to bring material that Tony had asked for. Then to stay, because he had found something in that place that seemed to give back to him a peace he didn't know he had lost. On one of those visits, while the two were walking among the olive trees at the end of the afternoon, Daniel stopped in front of one of the oldest trees and stared at the twisted trunk. "Do you think Dad used to come here alone?" he asked. Tony says yes, for years. "And he never told any of us?" "No." Daniel was silent for a moment. "I didn't know him as well as I thought," he said with an honesty that cost him something. Sarah stood beside him without answering. Sometimes silence was more honest than anything she could say. "He really liked it here," she said finally. "Tony said your father talked about this plot as the only place where he felt like himself." Daniel nodded slowly. There was pain in that, and he didn't try to hide it. "I should have paid more attention," he said. Sarah put her hand on his arm, not as comfort but as presence. "You're paying attention now," she said. They stayed there for a while longer, among the ancient olive trees that had survived more than 2 centuries, listening to the wind pass through the branches with that sound that seemed like a conversation from another time. It was on a Saturday morning that Mrs. Martha showed up at the plot. Sarah was there with Tony, discussing the planning for the next production cycle, when she heard the noise of a car on the dirt road. She turned and saw her mother-in-law's car stop near the old eucalyptus fence. Mrs. Martha got out alone. She was well dressed, as always, but there was something different about her that day. One less stiffness, a hesitation that Sarah had never seen in that woman's posture. Tony discreetly withdrew, like someone who understands that some things need to happen without witnesses. The 2 women looked at each other for a moment. The sun was hitting from the side, and the olive trees around made a soft noise with the breeze. "You didn't let me know you were coming," said Sarah. "No." Mrs. Martha looked at the trees around. "I wanted to see for myself." She was silent for a long moment, letting her eyes wander over the plot. There was something in her expression that Sarah couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret, exactly. It was something harder to admit. It was the look of someone seeing something for the first time that they should have seen a long time ago. "He used to come here," said Mrs. Martha, more to herself than to Sarah. "Samuel used to come here, and I never bothered to find out why." Sarah didn't respond. "I knew he had this plot," the mother-in-law continued, "but I thought it was a man's thing, not letting go of old land. I thought it had no value." A long pause. "I was wrong about a lot of things, Sarah." There was a confession in that sentence that must have cost a woman like Mrs. Martha dearly. Sarah remained silent, listening. "What you did here," said her mother-in-law, still looking at the olive trees, "was what any of my children should have had the courage to do, and none did. You did." Sarah still didn't answer. Mrs. Martha finally turned her face to her. Her eyes weren't wet, but there was a weariness in them that was more honest than any tear. "I don't know how to apologize properly," she said. "I never learned." A pause. "But I want to try." Sarah looked at that woman for a moment. All the history between them was there, suspended in the air among the olive trees. The years of silent contempt, the comments sharp as a razor blade, the laughter in the lawyer's office, the calculated visits to convince her to give up the plot of land. All of that was real. It wasn't going to disappear because an apology was spoken. But it was also real that Mr. Samuel had chosen to leave Sarah not just a plot of land, but a chance to prove that she was more than what the family had decided she was, and she had seized that chance with everything she had. Sarah extended her hand. Mrs. Martha looked at her for a second. Then she took her hand with both of hers, with a care that seemed different from everything that had existed between them until then. They said nothing more. They walked together among the olive trees for a few minutes, in silence. It was a silence different from the others that had existed between them. It wasn't the silence of contempt or tension. It was the silence of 2 people who still have much to learn about each other, but who have chosen to begin. The months that followed were the most intense and fullest that Sarah had ever lived. The partnership with Mrs. Beverley began to bear fruit in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. The oil from the century-old olive trees of Timber Ridge reached a regional fair of artisanal products and caught the attention of buyers she had never imagined reaching. A buyer from a specialty market who was traveling through the region looking for unique products for a chain of gourmet stores tasted the oil and placed an order that made Mrs. Beverley need to sit down for a moment to catch her breath. Sarah learned about the order on a Thursday afternoon, over the phone, with Mrs. Beverley's excited voice on the other end. After hanging up, she sat at the table for a while with her cell phone still in her hand. There was a moment, not long ago, when she was sitting in a room next to her husband, listening to barely concealed laughter, while she was assigned a ruin for $50. That moment hadn't disappeared from memory. It wouldn't disappear, but it had ceased to be the last in the story. Tony appeared on the veranda of the renovated stone cabin on a sunny afternoon with an olive branch in his hand, the way he had of appearing, unannounced, as part of the landscape. "Do you know why the olive tree was chosen as a symbol of peace?" he asked, sitting down on the stone bench. Sarah went to sit next to him. "I don't know." "Why?" "Because it's the tree that survives everything." He turned the branch between his fingers. "It survives drought, cold, abandonment, and it doesn't lose its roots." He paused. "It's the tree of those who stay." Sarah looked at him. "Are you comparing me to an olive tree, Tony?" The old man let out a short laugh, the first she had ever seen from him. "Mr. Samuel once told me that Daniel's wife was like an olive tree. He placed the branch on the bench between them. I didn't understand it back then. Now I understand." She kept those words for a long time. That night back home, she and Daniel had dinner together on the veranda. It was a simple thing, pasta and salad, but there was something about that dinner that seemed different from all the others they had had in recent years. A lightness, a mutual presence that had been absent for a long time. Daniel raised his glass of water for an informal toast. "To the olive trees," he said. "To the olive trees," she repeated. They drank in silence. Outside, the night at Timber Ridge was dark and full of stars, the kind that only exists far from a big city. Megan showed up a few weeks later, on the plot, on an afternoon Sarah wasn't expecting. She came in jeans and sneakers, with that look of someone who isn't sure if she's welcome, but came anyway. Sarah greeted her with a glass of juice and without asking questions. They sat in the shade of one of the larger olive trees and stayed in silence for a moment, listening to the wind. "I wish I had done more," Megan finally said. "You did what you could," Sarah said, without falsehood. "I should have spoken up louder when Robert started telling those stories. You sent me a warning at the right time. It was important." Megan stared at the olive trees with eyes slightly moist. She had that mix of relief and guilt that appears in people who did the minimum when they could have done more, but at least did the minimum when it was too hard to do anything. "Dad would have liked to see this," she said. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I think he saw it somehow," she said, and there was something in that sentence that wasn't fantasy or exaggeration. It was just the certainty that Mr. Samuel had planted with care something he hoped would grow after he was gone. Megan stayed until the end of the afternoon. They didn't talk about anything important. They had coffee on the porch of the renovated stone cabin, looked at the olive trees with the golden light of the end of the day filtering through the branches, and it was enough. Sometimes what needs to be mended between people doesn't need words. It just needs presence. Robert never went to the plot. He didn't call. He didn't send a message. His silence was a kind of answer, and Sarah accepted it as such. There were things that time needed to solve on its own, and forcing a reconciliation before it was ready would be as false as the calculated gestures the family had made when they wanted her to give up the property. Jennifer, the middle daughter, showed up months later, for a short and somewhat uncomfortable visit. She stayed a little while, spoke little, but before leaving, she stood in front of one of the larger olive trees and said, almost in passing, "I never knew Dad came here." Sarah didn't respond. She just stood beside her for a moment. Jennifer nodded, as if answering an internal thought, and left. That's how things got resolved, not with grand speeches or dramatic confrontations. With time, with presence, with the silent weight of truth that imposes itself without anyone needing to shout. There was a lesson there that Sarah hadn't looked for, but had found, that true justice rarely arrives with noise. It arrives slowly, almost in silence, built brick by people who decided not to give up even when everything pointed to giving up being the most sensible choice. The stone cabin underwent a small but careful renovation. Sarah didn't want to turn it into something else. She wanted to keep the stone character, the chimney, the thickness of the walls that kept the cool inside. The roof was redone, a new door installed, the irregular stone floor cleaned and preserved. Some new wooden shelves were installed where the old ones had given way. Tony was the one who chose what would go on them. Jars of pickled olives, small bottles of hand-labeled olive oil, and 2 dried olive branches that he said he had saved from an especially old branch that had fallen during a storm years before. "Samuel was sad when that branch fell," said Tony. "I saved it because I knew it would be worth something one day." Sarah placed both branches into the glass jar she had found on the original shelf of the cabin, the one that had survived everything, and left them there as part of the decor. There was a story in that cabin that was longer than her own, and she had chosen to be part of that story rather than the person who signs a paper and walks away. The farmers' market that took place every month in a neighboring town became a regular stop. Mrs. Beverly set up the stall, Sarah showed up to help when she could, and the olive oil from the trees of Timber Ridge slowly earned a small but steady name among people who knew how to appreciate what they had in hand. One afternoon, a producer from another region stopped by the stall and stood still for a long time after tasting. She asked Sarah where it came from. When Sarah told her about the trees, about their age, about the soil, the woman was quiet for a moment and then said, "You have something rare here, don't let it disappear." Sarah smiled. "I won't." There was a phrase Mr. Tony had said on the first afternoon they spent together, about being the tree of those who stay. Sarah had carried that phrase ever since, and as time passed, she understood more and more what he had meant. Staying was not passivity. Staying was not resignation. Staying was an active choice, made every day, not to give up on what was hers, when the easier thing would be to leave. She had stayed in that family when it would have been simpler to walk away. She had stayed by Mr. Samuel's side when the legitimate children were not there. She had stood firm in the face of laughter and scorn, with her spine straight and her eyes dry. She had stayed when her husband said he didn't want any trouble, and she had felt the ground crack beneath her feet. And she had stood before those olive trees on a windy, sunny day and chosen to understand what was there, instead of accepting the version everyone wanted her to accept. The olive trees had stayed for over 200 years, and now she was staying too. On an afternoon of the third year's harvest, Sarah was on her knees in the dirt, preparing an area Mr. Tony had pointed out to expand the planting with cuttings from the oldest trees, when she heard footsteps behind her. It was Daniel, with work gloves and a shovel. "Where do you want me to plant?" he asked simply. Sarah looked up at him. There was dirt on her hands and sun on his face, and the olive trees around them were old as stories the wind tells, without anyone knowing where they came from. "There," she said, pointing, "next to the oldest ones." He went, and she watched for a moment as her husband planted a new olive tree beside trees that had survived more than 2 centuries, and she thought that was something very small and at the same time very large. It was the kind of thing that doesn't appear in any document, any record, any will, but it is real just the same, and perhaps it is the most real part of everything. Mr. Tony appeared on the other side of the field with a bucket of water for the newly planted sapling. He was a man with white hair and a bent back who had guarded those trees for decades, who had been the sole witness to Mr. Samuel's silent love for that piece of land, and who now walked between the rows with the same calm as always, as if time didn't pass here the way it did out there. Sarah stood in the middle of the field, between her husband who was planting and the old man who was watering, between the ancient trees and the new saplings, with dirt on her hands and sun on her neck, and felt something that took a while for her to name. It was belonging, not the belonging of someone born in a place, the belonging of someone who chooses a place and who is chosen back. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. If something touched your heart, leave it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.